The soft hum of jazz trickled through the dimly lit restaurant, mingling with the scent of aged wine and freshly baked bread. Candles flickered on polished wooden tables, casting golden hues against the brick walls. The ambience was warm, intimate, at least for those who could afford the luxury. Deborah adjusted the cuffs of her uniform, exhaling softly as she balanced a tray in her hands. Her shift had been long, filled with the usual forced smiles and polite nods. But she had learned to navigate this world, one where she was seen but rarely acknowledged. A world where her voice mattered only when it was offering. "Would you like anything else, sir?" She moved through the tables with practiced ease, her senses attuned to the rustling of napkins, the clinking of silverware, and the quiet murmurs of the elite patrons who dined under chandeliers worth more than her rent. That was when she heard it. A laugh. Loud. Sharp. Drenched in mockery. She turned instinctively, her gaze landing on a man draped in a navy blue suit, a tumbler of whiskey resting between his fingers. He was speaking to a group of men, each one dressed in power, their ties tight, their watches glinting under the soft lights. But it was him who commanded attention. Leonard Grayson, a name whispered in business circles. Ruthless. Sharp. A man who built an empire on shattered dreams and relentless ambition. He did not just own wealth, he owned people's fears, their admiration, their silence. And at this moment, his eyes were fixed on her. "Tell me something," Leonard mused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Do they let you sing for tips here? Or just carry the plates?" His words were dipped in something cold, something cruel. A chuckle rippled through his table, though some men hesitated, watching, waiting, curious to see how she would react. Deborah felt her grip tighten on the tray. She had been here before. Not with him, but with men like him. The ones who believed money granted them permission to belittle, to control, to strip dignity away with a single sentence. She swallowed the heat rising in her throat and offered a polite, measured response. "Is there something else I can get for you, sir?" Her voice was steady, despite the pulse hammering beneath her skin. Leonard smirked. "Just an answer." He leaned forward, amusement flickering in his cold gray eyes. "You look like a singer, or at least, someone who wants to be one." A beat of silence. The room seemed smaller now. Eyes turning, murmurs pausing. Even the jazz felt quieter. She straightened her shoulders. "I used to be." Leonard feigned surprise. "Really? Then why are you here, saving drinks, instead of up there?" He gestured toward the grand piano tucked against the far wall. "Where the real talent is." Deborah's chest tightened. It was not the question that stung. It was the weight behind it. The implication that this was all she was worth. "Maybe because people like you never give people like me a chance," she said, her voice calm but cutting. A flicker of intrigue flashed in Leonard's eyes. He tilted his head, setting his whiskey down. "Is that so?" A slow smile curled his lips. "Then prove me wrong." He leaned back, arms crossing over his chest. "Play something. Let us see if you really had a dream worth chasing, or if you are just another story of wasted talent." The challenge hung in the air, thick with tension. The restaurant had gone still. Patrons were no longer focused on their meals. The air pulsed with something unseen, a moment stretching between humiliation and defiance. Deborah's hands trembled at her sides. She had spent years avoiding this exact situation, being placed under a spotlight she never asked for. But walking away now would mean letting him win, letting all of them win. Her gaze flickered toward the piano. It had been years since she touched one. Years since she let herself be the girl who once dreamed of filling rooms with music instead of plates with food. She took a breath. Then, without a word, she walked toward the piano, and the entire restaurant fell silent. Deborah's heels clicked softly against the polished floor, the sound swallowed by the thick anticipation in the air. Every step toward the grand piano felt heavier than the last, each one carrying the ghosts of a past she had buried. The polished mahogany shone under the dim light, its presence as intimidating as the expectant gazes that followed her. She could feel their eyes, watching, judging. She hesitated. For years, she had chosen silence over spectacle. It was safer, easier, and yet, here she was. A challenge she never asked for, a moment she never wanted. Behind her, Leonard took another sip of his whiskey, his smirk unwavering. He was enjoying this, watching her squirm, watching her battle hesitation. "Take your time," he drawled. I am sure we can all wait." Soft chuckles scattered across the room. Deborah closed her eyes. She needed to breathe. There was a time when she had been more than a waitress, more than polite smiles and quick apologies. Music had been her world, her lifeline. As a child, she would press her small fingers against the ivory keys of her grandmother's old piano, her heart swelling with the sound. Music had been more than just notes. It had been freedom. She could still hear her grandmother's voice. "The world will try to silence you, Debbie. Play louder." And she had. At 15, she had won her first competition. At 18, she had been offered a chance to study at one of the most prestigious music academies in the country. At 19, it had all fallen apart. Underscore 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 underscore. A dream stolen. Her mother had fallen ill. Bills piled up. Dreams did not pay rent. She had abandoned the piano to take on double shifts, replacing sheet music with auto tickets, replacing rehearsals with exhaustion. One missed opportunity turned into another, then another, until one day, she stopped playing altogether. Music became a ghost, lingering at the edges of her life. Never truly gone, never truly there. And now, years later, fate had dragged her back to this moment. Deborah's fingers hovered above the keys. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished surface. She could walk away. No one would stop her. No one would care. Or she could play. Not for him. Not for them. For herself. She inhaled deeply. And then, she played the first note. The sound was soft, fragile, a whisper in a room full of noise. Then another note, and another, until the melody began to bloom, unfolding like a long-forgotten memory. It was not just music. It was her story. Every heartbreak, every sacrifice, every moment she had swallowed her dreams for survival. The room, once filled with murmurs and clinking glasses, fell into utter silence. Even the waitstaff, her co-workers who had only ever known her as the quiet, hard-working Deborah, stood frozen. And then there was Leonard. His smirk had faded, his hand stilled on his glass. For the first time that evening, he had nothing to say. The music carried on, wrapping around the room, reaching places words never could. And when Deborah finally played the last note, a heavy stillness lingered. Seconds passed. Then, a single clap. Then another. Then another. Until the entire restaurant erupted into applause. Leonard leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He studied her, as if seeing her for the first time. "You have talent," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "Real talent." Deborah stood, meeting his gaze. "But you already knew that, did you not?" she said. It was not a question. He smiled, slow and calculating. "And yet, here you are, saving drinks instead of playing in concert halls." A flicker of pain crossed her face, but she did not let it linger. Not because of a lack of talent, she countered, but because people like you hold the keys to those concert halls. Leonard exhaled, amused but thoughtful. "Perhaps." He swirled the ice in his glass. "What would you say if I offered you a chance?" Her stomach tightened. "A chance," she echoed. "A real opportunity," he said. "Connections. Sponsorship. A way out of this place." The words hung between them, dripping with temptation. Deborah had spent years waiting for someone to offer her a lifeline. But something about the way Leonard said it made her hesitate. Because men like him never gave something for nothing. And she was not sure she was willing to pay the price. She needed to remember. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken weight. Deborah's fingers curled at her sides, her pulse still thrumming from the music. Leonard's gray eyes gleamed with something unreadable. Interest. Amusement. Something colder. "A way out," he repeated, leaning forward. "A real chance to get back what you lost." Deborah swallowed. She should have been thrilled. For years, she had dreamed of an opportunity like this. But coming from him, something felt off. She forced herself to keep her expression neutral. "And what exactly would I have to do for this chance?" Leonard's smirk widened, like a wolf who had just found an opening. "Dinner. Tomorrow night. At my private club. We will talk business." A few men at his table exchanged knowing glances. Deborah's stomach twisted. There it was. The catch. A world where men like Leonard held all the power, and women like her were expected to be grateful for any crumbs thrown their way. She had seen it happen before. Young, talented women being lured in with promises of success, only to realize too late that the cost was their dignity. But she was not naive. Deborah forced a small, polite smile. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully, "but I do not mix business with personal engagements." A flicker of surprise crossed Leonard's face. He was not used to rejection. "Is that so?" he murmured, tapping his glass. "And hey, I thought you wanted a real shot at success." Something in his voice shifted. The bait was gone. Now, it was a test. Deborah felt her muscles tighten. "Success should not come with conditions," she said, keeping her voice even. "If you truly believe in my talent, then let that speak for itself." Leonard chuckled, shaking his head. "You are bold. I will give you that." He leaned back, studying her like a puzzle he could not quite solve. "Fine," he said. "Play for me again. One private performance. No dinner. No expectations. Just music." Deborah hesitated. This felt different. Still dangerous, but less like a trap. "You are serious?" she asked. Leonard nodded. "You have talent, Deborah. Real talent. And I am a businessman. I know a good investment when I see one." A beat of silence. Then, finally, she nodded. "One performance," she agreed. And just like that, the deal was made. But Deborah had no idea that saying yes would change everything. That night, as the restaurant emptied, Deborah grabbed her coat and stepped into the cool night air. The city hummed around her, car horns, distant laughter, neon lights flickering in puddles on the pavement. She barely had a moment to process what had happened before a voice called out behind her. "Deborah." She turned to see Malik, one of the senior waiters, a man who had worked in the restaurant for over 15 years, a man who had seen too much. "Be careful with that one," he said, stepping closer. "Leonard Grayson does not do favors without expecting something in return." Deborah exhaled, rubbing her temples. "I know, but what choice do I have?" Malik sighed, glancing toward the street. "I have seen what happens when people owe him. It never ends well." Deborah studied his face. There was real concern there. "Then what would you do?" she asked. Malik was quiet for a long moment before shaking his head. "I would run, but I know you will not." He was right, because for all the risks, for all the dangers, this was the first chance she had been given in years, and she was not about to throw it away. The private venue was nothing like the cozy, dimly lit restaurant she worked in. This was a world of power. The kind of place where billionaires made deals over $1,000 whiskey, where people laughed with their mouths but not their eyes. Deborah stepped into the grand hall, her heart hammering. The stage was set. A sleek black piano gleamed under golden chandeliers. And in the front row, Leonard Grayson, dressed in another expensive suit, watching her with sharp curiosity. She swallowed her nerves and took a seat at the piano. This was it. Her moment. No distractions. No fears. Just music. Her fingers met the keys. And she played. But this time, she did not hold back. She poured everything into it. Every struggle. Every sacrifice. Every silent battle she had fought just to be here. The music swelled, filling the grand hall with something raw. Something real. And for the second time, Leonard had nothing to say. When the final note faded into the air, the room erupted into applause. But Leonard did not clap. He just stared. And then, slowly, he stood. The applause died down as he walked toward her, his expression unreadable. "You belong on a stage," he said, voice quiet but firm. Deborah's breath caught. "Then help me get there," she said. Leonard smirked. "I already am." He pulled something from his pocket, a sleek contract. Deborah hesitated. "What is this?" "An offer," Leonard said. "A real one this time." She took the papers, skimming through the fine print. It was real. A sponsorship deal. Performances. Exposure. Everything she had dreamed of. But something felt wrong. Then she saw it, the clause. A non-disclosure agreement. Complete control over where she played. Who she played for. Who she answered to. Her pulse quickened. This was not just an opportunity. It was ownership. She looked up at Leonard, who was watching her expectantly. "All you have to do," he said smoothly, "is sign." Deborah's hands trembled. This was everything she had wanted. But at what cost? The contract felt heavier than paper should. Deborah's eyes traced the fine print, her fingers brushing against the crisp edges. Leonard stood before her, waiting. Everything about him, his stance, his smirk, the cold certainty in his gaze, said he already knew what she would do. Because who would say no to an offer like this? "Take your time," Leonard said smoothly, as if he were being generous. "But just so we are clear, this is a one-time opportunity." A trap laced in velvet. Deborah knew what this meant. Signing would give her fame, exposure, a ticket out of a life spent serving people like him. But at what cost? Her freedom, her voice, her soul. Her fingers tightened around the pen. She wanted this. God, she wanted this. But Malik's warning echoed in her mind. "I have seen what happens when people owe him. It never ends well." She looked up at Leonard. "I need time," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Amusement, annoyance. But then, he chuckled. "Of course. But not too much time, Deborah. The world does not wait for indecisive people." He turned away, leaving the contract on the table. She watched him go, her pulse pounding. That night, Deborah could not sleep. She sat in her tiny apartment, staring at the contract spread out before her. The paper seemed to mock her. This was everything she had fought for, but it did not feel right. Her instinct screamed at her. She pulled out her phone, dialing the only person she could trust. Malik picked up after the second ring. "Tell me I am making the right choice," she said softly. Silence. Then a sigh. "You already know the answer, Deborah," Malik said. "That is why you called me." Her throat tightened. "But what if this is my only chance?" she whispered. Malik's voice was gentle but firm. "There will be other chances. There's only one you." Tears burned at the edges of her eyes. She knew what she had to do, but walking away from a dream felt like killing a part of herself. She swallowed hard, blinking back the emotions. Then, with a deep breath, she grabbed the contract and tore it in half. The next morning, Deborah walked into work, bracing herself. She knew Leonard would not take rejection lightly. And she was right. The moment she stepped into the restaurant, she felt it. The shift. The way her co-workers glanced at her, hesitant. The way the manager barely looked at her. Then, as she tied her apron, Malik pulled her aside. "You need to leave," he said quietly. Deborah frowned. "What?" Malik's face was grim. "Leonard made a call this morning. You are off the schedule. Permanently." A cold chill ran down her spine. "What?" she whispered. Malik's jaw tightened. "He owns this place, Deborah. You embarrassed him. He is making sure you pay for it." Her stomach twisted. Leonard had power, connections, and now he had turned that power against her. Deborah's heart pounded. No job, no income, no safety net. This was exactly what she had feared. And it was only the beginning. Over the next 3 days, everything fell apart. Every job application she sent was denied. Calls went unanswered. Even places that had been hiring yesterday suddenly had no openings. It was him. Leonard was making sure she had no way forward, except the one that led back to him. Her savings were running low. Her rent was due. Fear clawed at her chest. Was this how it ended? Was this how dreams died? On the 4th day, hope arrived in the most unexpected way. Deborah was sitting in a tiny cafe, her untouched coffee growing cold, when a woman slid into the seat across from her. She was older, dressed in a simple but elegant black suit. Sharp eyes, kind smile. "You are Deborah, correct?" the woman asked. Deborah tensed. "Who is asking?" The woman extended a business card. "Clara Hastings, talent manager." Deborah's breath hitched. "I was at the restaurant the night you played," Clara continued, "and I have not been able to get your performance out of my head." Deborah blinked. "You were there?" Clara nodded. "And I was hoping we could talk about your future." Hope flared in Deborah's chest. Leonard had tried to break her, but he had unintentionally given her an audience. And now, she might just have another chance. One that did not come with chains. This was not over. Not by a long shot. Deborah gripped a business card, her pulse quickening. Clara Hastings. A real talent manager. Someone not tied to Leonard. This could be it. You are serious? Deborah asked, still wary. Clara smiled. I am. Your talent speaks for itself, Deborah. And I want to help you build a career, the right way. No contracts with hidden clauses. No power plays. No debts to men like Leonard. For the first time in years, Deborah saw a way forward. One that did not require her to compromise who she was. She took a deep breath and nodded. I am in, she said. Word traveled fast. By the next morning, Leonard knew. And he was not pleased. Deborah was locking up her apartment when she heard a car door slam. She turned, her heart stopping. Leonard stood on the curb, his sleek black car behind him. He was alone, but his presence was enough. You have some nerve, he said, stepping closer. Deborah stiffened. You do not control me, Leonard. His jaw tightened. You really think this Clara Hastings woman can give you what I can? She is offering me a real career, Deborah said. Not a contract that puts me in chains. Leonard scoffed. You think you are better than the rest? That you can just say no to me and walk away? Deborah's hands curled into fists. You tried to ruin me, she shot back. You made sure I could not find work. You wanted to break me until I had no choice but to crawl back. Leonard's eyes darkened. I gave you a way out. You refused it. A way out? Deborah let out a bitter laugh. You do not give people a way out, Leonard. You give them a cage and call it freedom. Silence. For the first time, Leonard's smirk vanished. A storm brewed behind his gray eyes. You just made an enemy, he said, his voice calm but laced with warning. Deborah held her ground. No, she said. I just took back my power. Leonard studied her for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and got into his car. The sleek vehicle roared to life, and in seconds, he was gone. Deborah let out a slow, shaky breath. She had won this battle, but she knew the war was not over. Not yet. 2 weeks later, Deborah stood backstage, heart racing. She had spent years waiting for this moment. Now, she was here. Thanks to Clara, she had been booked for an exclusive live performance. The kind that could launch a career. The grand hall was packed. Hundreds of influential people filled the seats. This was real. This was hers. She stepped onto the stage, the grand piano waiting for her. She took a seat. Her fingers brushed the keys. Then, she played. And this time, she did not just play music. She played her story. Her pain. Her fight. Her victory. The audience felt it. By the time she struck the final note, the room exploded into applause. People rose to their feet. Tears filled some eyes. And just like that, Deborah was no longer invisible. She was seen. She was heard. She was free. The next morning, headlines flooded the internet. A star is born. Deborah's performance leaves audiences stunned. Raw. Powerful. Unforgettable. Who is Deborah? And the best part, Leonard Grayson's name was nowhere in sight. He had tried to control her, tried to own her, tried to break her. And in the end, she had won. On her own terms. Sunlight streamed through the large windows of Clara's office as Deborah sat across from her, still processing what had happened the night before. The applause still echoed in her ears. The flood of reporters, the social media explosion, everything had changed overnight. You are a sensation, Clara said with a smile, sliding a tablet across the desk. Deborah glanced down. Articles, tweets, clips from the performance going viral. People were talking about her. Not about Leonard. Not about a waitress playing piano in a restaurant. About her talent. She swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. This was real. Clara leaned forward. Offers are already coming in. Bookings, sponsorships, even a potential album deal. Deborah blinked. An album. Clara smiled. You are not a hidden talent anymore, Deborah. The world sees you now. Deborah took a shaky breath. She had fought for so long. And now, she had made it. Leonard sat at the corner booth of an upscale cafe, swirling his usual glass of whiskey, even in the middle of the day. When Deborah walked in, he looked up, his smirk already in place. You have been busy, he said. Deborah sat across from him, calm, Steady. I have. Leonard exhaled slowly, tilting his head. I underestimated you, he admitted. You have real talent. I never doubted that. But I did not think you had the guts to walk away from me. Deborah folded her hands on the table. You do not own me, Leonard. You never did. He studied her for a long moment before letting out a chuckle. You really think you won? I know I did, Deborah said. Leonard's smirk wavered. For the first time, he was the one unsettled. Be careful, he said finally. This world is not kind to people who refuse to play by its rules. Deborah leaned in slightly. Then I will make my own rules, she said. She stood, grabbing her bag. And with that, she walked away. For good. But of course, Leonard was not done yet. Deborah knew at the moment she saw the message waiting on her phone. One last meeting. Face to face. She considered ignoring it. But something in her told her that to truly move forward, she had to confront the past one last time. So she went. Weeks passed. Deborah's name grew bigger. Her music spread. She performed in places she never dreamed of. She signed deals that gave her freedom, not control. And most importantly, she did it all without selling her soul. One evening, after a long day of rehearsals, she sat at her piano, the city lights twinkling outside her apartment window. She placed her fingers on the keys. This time, she played for herself. No audience. No expectations. Just music. And for the first time in years, she felt whole again. The applause had faded. The headlines would, too. But one thing would always remain. Her music. And this time, she was the one in control.